Yeah, I am Reverend John Odden, and my topic for today is being divinely useful. And I will tell you that after Randy made that first introduction, I might have just simply got up and said what he said. And you'd have had it. It was all there. Or after Susan shared the reading and the prayer, I might have said what she said, and we'd have had it all. Or even after the band performed and we heard the songs, if you were catching the lyrics of some of that, what they sang, and we'd have had it. But actually, I come to this being divinely useful, I don't know if it's from the bottom up or inside out or backwards, but I actually came to it from the notion of useless. And as I thought about that, and I looked at some of the things that were out there in the world today, where people were saying what was useless or what couldn't be done, I went from that to thinking about, well, what is useful? What is our place? What is our power? And I came up with a few thoughts, and I'll share them this morning to those of you that are, live streaming and reality streaming, just a few thoughts about useless and useful. And maybe you'll find something in that for you. I hope that you do, because I think it's an important time right now for each and all of us. So, I did want to anchor with a little bit of a reading, and I went looking for divinely useful, and in the science of mind, what I found was useless, but I thought it was apropos. And I was looking for something about the mind being useful, and what I got was man's mind is the mind of God, functioning at the level of man's understanding of his place in the universe. Man contacts the mind of God at the center of his own being. It is useless to seek elsewhere. Useless, useful. The highest God and the innermost God is one God. Through the medium of mind, man unifies with the universe and contacts a power that can do anything for him that he is able to conceive of its doing. So divine inspiration, potent and useful. All the rest, useless. So now what I'd like to do is just shift over to the original source of my thought about talking about useless and useful. And it goes back to a fellow who was a teacher when I was a student in college. He happens to be an eminent, a late eminent quantum scientist, Richard Feynman. And I was, a lot of people who were in a room with Professor Feynman would put out in their resume or their CV, I was a student of Feynman. I was qualified to be in a room with the man, and that was the limit of it. I wouldn't call myself a student. I wasn't at that level whatsoever. But I was able to be in the room, and then I came into possession of a recording of a public lecture that he gave. It's about 1980, and the occasion was 30 years after something called the Manhattan Project. And I think that is a little bit poignant today because we're having issues in the modern world with how we control and attitudes towards these things out there, these nuclear weapons. And that Manhattan Project was where those were born and then ultimately used to end a problem that humankind was having a hard time solving called the Second World War. So Feynman shared in his lecture, and to get to useless, I'm going to go really fast, and maybe there'll be some other time when we could talk about other parts of this that are fascinating, but we're going to go really fast forward. Like he finishes his PhD, he wants to be a scientist. And then this fellow named Robert Wilson comes to him and says, we have a special project, you need to help us. And he tells him what the project is. And Feynman says, I won't do that, I'm not interested, no thank you. And then he thinks about it a bit and he watches the news. Oh darn, I gotta do it. And from the time he got his PhD, it was, just a second. It was 1943. By March of 1943, he's down there at Los Alamos working on the Manhattan Project. And they're working, solving it, and it's a tough science problem. There's a lot of science, a lot of engineering. They're working really hard, using everything they know and then some to try to come to the answer, driven by the belief that if they don't solve the problem and somebody else solves it first, things could end badly. They really were driven by that. So then they succeed, and it comes down to the fateful date. June of 1946. The first test succeeds. And so Feynman, as he did in his later years, and he's renowned for doing, and he did at that time, was sitting out there in a Jeep with his drums, drumming. Much like you'll see Gretchen do on those drums, which I got and donated based on the inspiration of Feynman and the drums he used to love to play for students as well as after they invented things like nuclear weapons. And he was doing that, and he saw this fellow walking by, really mopey and upset looking, and it was Robert Wilson who brought him to the project. And Robert Wilson said, I don't think we should have done it. And Feynman talks about saying, no, it was important. We had to do it. And Wilson was not a good idea. And at those times, there were different people having different things, as we have in the modern day, about is having powerful weapons good or not? Can we trust people and the leaders that they wind up having to deal with that? It was an issue then, an issue now, and that was going on. So they disbanded, and Feynman got a job at Cornell. And while he was at Cornell, he did the work that subsequently, in 1965, got him awarded Nobel Prize in Physics. He did brilliant work. But what he shared in his public lecture that he gave in 1980 is that he would go home to where he grew up in New York City on the weekends. And he would just think about where he was, and he would think about what happened in Japan. And he would imagine the blast radius. And he was sad. It bothered him. He was concerned. Can we trust humankind to never use these again? It really bothered him. And what he shared at the end of his lecture, he talked about all kinds of fascinating stuff. He rarely spoke in public, but he spoke in public, talked about all this fascinating stuff. And at the end he said how deeply it struck him that for several years after this achievement, this difficult achievement, not his favorite achievement, but an important one, he would see people paving a road, putting up a bridge, or around the city or in the suburbs, building a building, a skyscraper in the city or a home in the suburbs as he was coming and going, and how it struck him. He didn't know where it came from. It struck him. Don't they understand? Doing anything new is useless. Useless. And I think that really is the counterpoint. If you get down into the spiritual principles, it's, do we have an inspiration, and are we called to do something divinely? And are we going to be divinely useful? Or might we be sucked in to the notion, why bother? It's useless. And I somewhat have the sense that that's a way to crystallize that tension, that to and fro between being disabled and disconnected from our birthright, our spiritual power, and instead the ability to say, wait a minute, Spirit's in me, I can step up, I can do something, I can be divinely useful. I also think it's kind of fascinating in the case of the physicist Richard Feynman, who got the Nobel Prize for what he did during that period, when he remembered that profound sense that he would look out at people doing new stuff and he would feel like, oh, it's useless. Even during that time, and he expresses gratitude that he was able to do his science, do his physics, solve some problems, publish some stuff, and get the Nobel Prize for it. He was profoundly creative. He was obviously connected with his divine potential to do things in the field that he loved, physics, and be recognized for it at the highest level we have, the Nobel Prize. And yet he would just look out at people doing stuff, and he was just struck by how it seemed useless. And he did say in 80, which is, some number of years after the weapons were used to end that war, how glad he was that humankind had kept that thing in the bottle for 3 decades, and how he hoped that could be done forevermore. And he didn't really remember when he got past this notion that doing new things was useless, but he recognized how profoundly it hit him. And I think there is a lesson in that the forces to look at truly are thinking that things are useless, listening to other people say that might be useless, being drawn into the idea that trying to march for change, vote for change, work for change, donate for change is useless, versus doing the inner work to understand, where am I called? Where am I motivated? Is it spirit in me? Am I a divine manifestation? Can I put my energy, my word, cooperative effort with others towards being useful? And I think that's really what it comes down to. And as history gets written and we look at how does humankind get past the things that are gnawing at us here in the current era, it'll be, can we not get paralyzed by the notion that it's useless to try, to care, to reach out, to speak, versus standing in our divine usefulness, being divinely useful. I think that's really what it does come down to. Now, as I was trying to understand what was going on with Feynman and the way that he was a little bit stuck in this notion that it's useless to do anything new. And what a profound notion for someone so incredibly creative to think that it's useless. I'm going to go and just take a little aside, one little fun piece that I want to bring in. You know, one of the things that comes into his Nobel Prize was different people will allude to the fact that he saw a plate spinning, and that doing the calculations of the math and the physics of a plate spinning led him to some of his work that got him the Nobel Prize. And what most of the people get wrong when they tell that story was he saw the plate spinning in a dormitory food fight at Cornell. As a professor, he chose to live in the dormitories there. That was before he developed some social graces and skills and got married and started having what we would call a more typical normal life. He was living in dormitories while he was a professor doing the work that won the Nobel Prize. And it actually was a food fight. And I really understand about that because at the college I went to, where I was able to go and meet him and listen to him speak once in a while, I was not his student. And I'm not there in physics whatsoever, but I was able to appreciate him and enjoy what he would share. That college and the dormitory I was in would also have those food fights. Now, how would you know there'd be a food fight? The energy would be bubbling up, people would be working an issue or frustrated, and somebody would shout, "Food fight," and people would throw plates, and there'd be china, there'd be ham and beef and green beans flying around. In fact, one time we had a famous guest who said, "I've heard that you people actually are like savages and you have food fights." And the person next to him got up and said, "Food fight." But it actually was the motion of a plate tumbling and wobbling through the air as Professor Feynman sat there at Cornell watching a food fight that led him to think, wait a minute, the equations of the tumbling plate will be the way we solve the mysteries of quantum electrodynamics and deal with all this complex quantum science that nobody else can figure out. It took somebody hurling a plate for this smart scientist to be created to do that, even though he went out there and would look at people doing things and would say, didn't anyone tell them it's useless? So as part of that, like, how did Feynman get that way? I went back and I was looking for a source to help understand that. And I found children's letters to God. I thought, that would be an interesting source to help understand this. And I found a really short letter. You know, kids can be brief and succinct. So what does the child write to God? Are you really invisible, or is this some kind of a trick? You know, and isn't that about it? Because Feynman was there looking at people, and he knew that it troubled him. He was sure that they didn't get the word that it's useless, but he didn't know where it came from. He doesn't know how he got over it. He was grateful that people around him didn't get stuck on that like he did. He expressed that gratitude specifically. But yet somehow in that spiritual equation, parts of it are not easily seen and not necessarily consistent and reliable to the conscious, rational regard. It takes being open to the divine spark, being willing to understand, like, what am I inspired to do? What do I see that would be divinely useful? What calls to me? And I'm willing to stand up and do it. And I'm going to tell you another story in a moment, a personal one, not about someone else, but more about me. And I would tell you that when you listen to the story, please understand that I don't think the ability to be divinely useful has anything to do with whether a person is a president, a pope, a reverend, a practitioner, or anything. My understanding is that this spark of divinity comes to all of us equally, and that the moment that we choose to stand and do something, we're all on an even playing field. Our potential to speak authentically, powerfully, with love, and with a vision for what could be great, it's the same. It's given to all of us. And how do I know that? I think there's a really simple test that anyone can take to understand whether they're on that level playing field. And it's called, did you see the light and wake up this morning? Spirit put you here, fully equipped, fully capable, no more, no less, all equal, all able to do that work. Yet, sometimes it's interesting to look at a story and go a little deeper. And for this one, I thought it was also interesting to, as I was out there looking for useful, finding useless, to go into the Bible, where in 1 Corinthians 15, you find, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. And so to me, that's an exhortation, to turn to the divine, to honor the principle, so that faith can be useful, not useless. Well, now let's go over someplace else. And it is a personal example of a family friend, and it's all incredibly real. For the purpose of this, what we'll call the friend Ralph. Ralph had a problem and was in recovery, and I observed that Ralph's family wanted to be in touch with Ralph, although physically being together was hard. And I noticed that the family was all into that, media stuff and the iPhones and the iMessages and all of that. And so I said, well, I'll provision an iPhone for Ralph to help. And what did people say? Well, what a wacky idea, John, that's useless. You got to be kidding. Really, that phrase, once you become aware of it and you start listening, where do people say something is useless? It's out there. And it doesn't have too many synonyms. Usually they'll just say, that's useless, once you start becoming aware and listening. So that was useless, got it to him. Well, they started iMessaging once he had it. Nobody particularly said, oh, this is really useful, but it was out there and he had it and that was going on. And then a big holiday weekend came and they're trying to be in touch with Ralph. How's it going? No response. Holiday weekend, Ralph's missing. By the end of the following week, they do a missing persons report. And the police say, well, not so much of a chance, and people are adults, and if the person had recovery and whatnot, maybe he's back, whatever. And so then I said, well, I'll contact AT&T and I'll see if they can use that thing. I've heard that you can find iPhones. You may not be able to decrypt them and read what's inside, but you can find them. And people said, that's useless. How crazy are you? I called AT&T and they gave me a case number. I called the police and I gave them the case number because AT&T said, we can't tell you anything, but we give you a case number. The police will know what to do. And this is just me, John Citizen, right? And then a few days later, the police say, we found Ralph, John Doe, on life support and in an ICU. OMG. Whoa. Now, people went and visited him and prepared for the worst. The doctors at the hospital said he was without oxygen for quite a while. We can't give you a lot of hope here, and they're trying to make the tough decisions. And I happened to have a business meeting near the hospital, and I said, well, I'll just stop by and pray with him. Practitioners do this, spiritual mind treatment, prayer, we do it. It's like the prayer ministry of Centers for Spiritual Living. And people said, well, that's useless. How crazy are you? He's on life support and we're preparing to pull the plug and you're going to go pray with Ralph. I mean, really? Why don't you do something productive? They didn't say something useful, but useless. But I went and did it. And I went in there, I sat with Ralph. The nurse explained to me to be prepared that it could be an upsetting experience to see someone that that's this way. I did that and I came back, and because I was the last one there, when the call came the next week, they happened to grab my card that I left when I signed in, and they called me. So then I reached out to the next of kin to tell them, and they said, "Oh no, we knew the call was coming. Tell us exactly what happened." And I told them exactly what the nurse told me. I said, "He woke up and he remembers everything any of us said while we were with him." And a few people said, "We appreciate your praying him back, but did you have to bring back his remembering everything we said in that room?" But that's not because I was a practitioner or nothing. That's just people, faith, prayer, and the world. And I think the important thing to remember in all of that is that when you're out there and the door opens for something to happen or not happen, or when something happens and it's a question, are we going to back it up, deal with it, or walk away? Just listen. Open your heart. Open the window to spirit and pay attention. Is it just the human side of people saying it's useless, there's nothing we can do? Or is it spirit saying you're invited to be divinely useful? Because I think truly it's in every one of us equally to be divinely useful in any situation. And I believe the opportunity that we all have together in life, whether it's in this spiritual community or out on the street, is just to be divinely useful, just to have our heart and our inner ear open to when that opportunity comes. Because we can all do such beautiful things. And it's not necessarily like I in no way have any concept that I went and did a Lazarus and brought Ralph back from any place. I just went and prayed and was there as a loving presence, and that was enough. Spirit does the work. Come on. Spirit does the work. If you look at yourself and how you're here and even the history of your life and what it might be going forward, Spirit does the work, and if you open, you get a pretty good ride. And isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? So what I would like to leave with you is this. We do have, as a Center for Spiritual Living, we have a curriculum, we have classes, and what's that about? It is the opportunity to practice a bit. A practitioner is someone who just practiced a bit. A reverend gets a little more practice on some other things. It's just a bit of practice. So those classes are a bit of practice. And if this point about useless, useful, and where do I want to put my energy? If it calls to you, then think about, which of the classes, what kind of timing and cost and so forth call to you. What would work that this community could do to support you in opening the world to your being divinely useful as much as possible and having the discernment to watch. For that little thing that pops up, useless. You want to get pretty good, I think, at doing whack-a-mole on useless if you want to maximize the opportunity of being here in this beautiful experience of life in Southern California that we all share. Because the useless is the debilitator. It just shuts down any good that could happen that fast. And if you listen, you'll hear it. In fact, suggest doing something and just see who says, "I'm with you," and who says, "Why bother? It's useless." Pay attention to that. And if you actually mull this over and you think, Reverend John had a point, I'm interested in being more divinely useful, let it sit with you for the week and come back next week, and seek me out or seek someone out and talk about what can we all do to help each other be more divinely useful, because it is the great opportunity for all of us. I think it's the linchpin of what draws us all together, the opportunity to celebrate together and truly to be divinely useful. Thank you.